All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Got a new process here where we do a roll call for the record. So if folks could signify your present or absence when I call your name, I would appreciate it. Commissioner Pasco is present. Commissioner Phillips.
Present.
Commissioner Drazan.
Present.
Commissioner Fitz will be here, is absent now, but supposedly will be here. Commissioner Lopes is absent. Commissioner Murphy.
Present.
Commissioner Peterson is absent. Commissioner Schroedel is absent. And Commissioner Wilson.
Present.
Great. Got through that. And then we have a process here. Welcome, everyone. We have a process here where we take public comment at the beginning of our meetings on anything that is unrelated to the agenda. So there will obviously be a public comment opportunity for the work plan, which is on our agenda tonight. But we have some time if folks are here who want to address issues that are not on our agenda and would like to get out of here before we spend the rest of the evening on other items. Is there anyone in the public that would like to offer information to the commission? All right, I'm seeing some folks in the room, but I'm assuming you're all here for the public hearing. Excellent. So we will go ahead and move forward with that. I have a little bit of a script here that I have to read at the beginning of our public hearings, if folks would bear with me. It's always fascinating. So welcome. The meeting is now open for consideration of the 2019-2020 long-range work plan. The Planning Commission is charged with making a recommendation on the application to the Board of County Commissioners. The record from this hearing will be forwarded to the board, which will make the final decision on this matter. Tonight's hearing will not go beyond 10 p.m. If not concluded, it will be continued to a time and date certain. I think we'll be out of here well before 10. Conduct of the hearing will be conducted as follows. First, the Planning and Zoning Division will give a staff report. We will enter into the record any additional correspondence received. There will be public testimony with a maximum of 3 minutes per speaker. We will then close the public hearing and the Planning Commission will discuss and take action. If you wish to speak tonight, please fill out a testimony form and submit it to the Administrative Assistant Darcy over here to my right. Please, when you come to the table, please state your name and where you are from. It's not necessary for you to give us your exact address, but where you live is always helpful to us. And let us know if you're representing anyone and when you come to the testimony table. So those are the instructions. I believe there are cards in the back. I think you all have probably figured that out by now. If you have any questions, ask Darcy. And with that, we will move forward with the staff report. So welcome. Thank you.
Good evening, commissioners. My name is Karen Burig. I'm the Long Range Planning Manager. Tonight, we're going to walk through this proposal for the staff recommendation for the Long Range Planning Work Program. But tonight, the steps really are, first of all, I'll give a staff presentation. We'll be able to take public testimony. There will be the Planning Commission discussion about the staff recommendation, and then ultimately we'll get to the Planning Commission recommendation. So is my mic on? Can you guys hear me? Okay. So first of all, we're here tonight so you can receive a presentation on the Long Range Planning Work Program. But also this is your opportunity to hear directly from some of the people, the citizens, the organizations that have submitted comments. All of the comments that were submitted are included in this attachment A, and they have been summarized. So I want to start off with first talking a little bit about the outreach that was done to be able to get us to where we are today. So we started this in the fall of 2018, and this is a process that we've been doing for the past 7 years to be able to gain input into our long-range planning work program. And in fall of 2018, we've sent out notices to our interested parties list, which includes cities, CPOs, county departments, and other interested parties that have given us their contact information over the years. We also did a presentation to the community leaders meeting in November of 2018. We asked for comments to be submitted by December, We also touched base with you in February and talked with the Board of County Commissioners about their input into the work program in March of 2019. Let's just see. Oops, I'm back again. So, the input we received. As we said, there is attachment A, which is the input received from the outreach. And the attachment A has basically, we heard from about 19 different individuals, organizations, during the time period we were collecting input. Even today, or even the last couple of days, we received a couple of more input. You should have a table also included in your packet that describes, it's the exhibit list. So that's a specific record of all of the different folks that gave us information, as well as the information that they gave us. So that's all within your packet tonight. Here in Exhibit A, we actually organized the input because some of the input we received was complementary. As you can tell, there were some sources of the proposal that came from two different organizations, but they really worked together and were the same proposal. And as well, some organizations gave us several different ideas to work from. So from that, there was basically, we called out about 29 different projects that could potentially be considered long-range planning work program items. There were also 10 additional suggested items that we actually were classified as not kind of appropriate for long-range planning, in that they were perhaps actually requesting capital projects, capital transportation projects, which are projects that we would build. So it's not a planning project per se, or perhaps it actually was a responsibility of a different organization. So that's at the tail end of the list are the projects that people had suggested to us, but really don't fall within the long-range planning work program. Oops, let's see. Make sure I'm doing this right. So to develop our recommendation, we considered several different things. So one, and as we spoke with you about at the last meeting that we had with you in February, is that we are looking to shift to a multi-year work program. So we included that in our decision-making process to develop the recommendation. We also were looking at ways that we could incorporate updates to the comprehensive plan. We had heard both from the Planning Commission as well as the Board of County Commissioners that there was an interest in being able to update the comprehensive plan. We looked at Board of County Commissioner priorities. We spoke with the board about their priorities, and we also looked at their strategic plan. At the last time we spoke with you, you were interested in knowing what those priorities were that you weren't able to address and include on the work program last year, so we looked at those priorities. And then we also balanced it all with staff availability. So attachment B is the multi-year work program. So this looks different. This is different than in past years. In past years, we looked at 1 year at a time. So this year, we're asking, hey, let's see if we can actually look farther out. Perhaps be able to, by doing this, it allows us to be a little bit more proactive rather than reactive. And that was one thing that we also heard from the Planning Commission. How can we look into the future to be able to help both ourselves, but also our constituents know when things were coming forward? So the other reason we're looking at a multi-year work program is because projects take longer than 1 year. They often take longer than 1 year, depending on the type of project it is. They can't all be contained within a year. So this really allows us to address the fact that there are different timelines for different types of projects. I think, as I said before, it kind of improves our transparency with the community about what type of work we're looking at doing in the future. And then it also helps us kind of facilitate the amount of time and potentially reduce the amount of time that we need to, actually, it will reduce the amount of time we would be spending on a yearly work program, if that makes sense. So since we won't have to be going through this we won't be going through this particular process every year. It would be an every other year process. So with respect to updating the comprehensive plan, what we did to help us understand what it might take to update the comprehensive plan, in your attachment A, we grouped each of the different potential projects by comprehensive plan chapter. So that allows us to see where there might be proposals that are similar and complementary, but maybe there's also actually suggested projects that conflict with each other. There was, as I said before, there's interest both by the Planning Commission and the board to be able to look at the comprehensive plan. There are several chapters of the comprehensive plan that haven't been updated in over 20 years. Some of the chapters have been updated, but others haven't. So one of the other particular things that this would allow us to do was really allow us to capitalize on economies of scale of being able to do different projects together, as well as update the comprehensive plan chapter at the same time. So when we spoke with the Board of County Commissioners in March, one of the questions was, what are your priorities? Coming out of the last Planning Commission meeting, there was an interest in understanding what the board's priorities are. So housing for the board is a top priority. The priorities under that, it was much more difficult to get clear direction on because it needed to be talked about a little bit more. But it was very clear that housing is a top priority for the board. Also within their guiding document, which is Performance Clackamas, they do have action items related specifically to housing. And the one that there's an action item, and I clipped it out up there, is they have a goal of reaching by 2022, 2,000 units of housing affordable to a variety of residents that will be developed within Clackamas County through a combination of public and private partnerships and appropriate, and this is the piece that's important to us, and appropriate regulatory changes, right? I think they acknowledge that it might be that the way their current regulations are, that they won't be able to achieve that. So they understand that there might need to be regulatory changes.
Can I ask a quick question? When I read through that, I was curious, and it doesn't have to do with our portion, which is the appropriate regulatory changes portion, but how do they count that 2,000 units? Does that assume everybody within Clackamas County, as in cities, and are contributing to that goal of 2,000 units by 2020? Do you already, if you know?
So I can't answer that specifically. Yeah. But I do know that our Clackamas County Housing Authority does serve both cities and county residents.
Right.
So if I had to guess, it really is talking about both the city and county.
I would assume, but thank you.
Sure. So looking, yes.
I was just saying, as long as we're stopped for questions.
Oh, yeah. Go ahead.
I don't know who came up with attachment B, but they deserve a raise. It's really it totally transforms the way we think about this. I think it's really a genius way of laying this out. I think it's really well done.
Thank you. It was a group effort.
You all deserve raises.
So past Planning Commission priorities, this again came from the last meeting. People were wondering, we know we left something off the table last time. Really, what was that? I went through and looked at the minutes from that meeting, and the priority project that really was left off, that that rose up to the top, but really couldn't be fit in anywhere, had to do with a small-scale manufacturing in commercial areas. So that particular project, again, was resubmitted into the work program this year and is listed on your attachment A as L18. I also just wanted to highlight that one of the past priorities as well was the fact that there was staff time involvement in the housing needs assessment, as well as the housing affordability and homelessness task force. And that really is, that is something that staff was working on, but it lends and gives support to the fact that we should continue the work on housing. So, and then as we always talk about at these meetings, we balance all of these interests and desires and potential projects with the actual ability for us to have staff time to do the work. So again, good news, we have a planning director. We are actually practically 6 months out of this fiscal year without a planning director. And so now we have a planning director and we have a long-range planning manager. We also do have transportation and land use staff that is currently working on these type of projects. But we continue to face the staffing challenges. There always will be issues about trying to replace those positions that have been left vacated. So we were considering that as we were moving forward. And then we're also thinking about different constraints that we know we'll be facing in the upcoming months when we talk about funding for the long-range planning program through the general fund and the forecast that we're looking at. Oh, and thank you. We talked about this, and so Cheryl, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah. Hi, good evening, Commissioners. I'm Cheryl Bell. I'm the Assistant Director of Development for the department. And Karen asked me to kind of jump in here and talk about staffing availability, because from the perspective of Department Administration, this is kind of where I've been embedded in the budget and looking at the overall structure of the program, so I could give you a little bit more insight into this one. As Karen introduced herself this evening, you noted that she is introducing herself as a long-range planning manager. And so that's one of the two ways that staffing is reflected in this program that you see before you. We have promoted Karen to long-range planning manager because of our commitment to this program. We've heard from the Board of County Commissioners, yourselves as the Planning Commission, and the community that our planning program is important, and we wanted to really put the resources and leadership behind that. So this year, the program will be led by Jennifer and Karen. The second way that staffing is reflected in the proposal in front of you is in the staff we have available to do the work in the program. For transportation, we have 3 staff members who dedicate about 3/4 of their time to this work, and that's reflected in the proposal. For land use, there have been some changes. We have 2 staff members who dedicate half their time to this program. That's down from years past. In the upcoming fiscal year, which is 1920, which is what we're budgeting for now, we had a reduction in our general fund maintenance level funding. And that was coupled with some rise in allocated cost. And then for fiscal year 2021, there is a possibility of another decrease in general fund maintenance level. And 2021 feels pretty far away. You're trying to understand why it's relevant. But for all of our programs in the department, we do a 5-year projection, and that's very important to us. It helps us stay sustainable in our budgeting and allocating our resources. And in light of these reductions and rising allocated costs, we're seeing a little bit more constraints on our resources. So what that did is that in making the program this year, is we pulled away some funding we had set aside for some consultants. And currently, right now, we have budgeted 3 positions in the planning program that are vacant. We're going to go ahead and fill the senior planner, and then we're looking at the other 2 and strategizing a little bit more on how to fill those positions. So that affects the staff that's available to staff this program. In reaction to that, you'll see a little bit longer extension on some of the programs, and we manage the overlaps a little bit better, so we have more staff available, so we're not doing multiple things at once, and we can focus staff as we go along and still be strategic. The other thing is really using the issue paper, which I know Karen's going to talk about here in a minute, as a tool to really dive into the issues that are things like affordable housing is a very large package. Use the issue paper to dive in, make more decisions as we go along, and then be able to implement our staff in that way. So that's the kind of things you'll see reflected as Karen goes next into our recommendations, and then as you consider what to recommend for next year.
All right, so I have a couple different slides that we're going to kind of step through what the recommendation is. So again, the staff recommendation is included on this attachment B. And I think the first part really is to note that it is a multi-year recommendation. We actually provided a little more detail, broke down into the quarters for fiscal year 2019 and 2020, so that's next fiscal year. We broke that down into quarters as well as fiscal year 2020 and 2021. We also included out 3 additional fiscal years, not as much detail, but to really be able to start to say how we can kind of look at what priorities there might be for us in those future years. So I wanted you to just be able to look at that. I think another thing I'll call out right now, and it's probably easier to see on the sheet than necessarily on the screen. You can see that there are different colors that we used. So the blue projects here are the transportation projects. The green projects are the projects that are land use focused and require land use staff, long-range planning staff. But I think we also are trying to call out the fact, and that's in the dark green, is that for several of the transportation planning projects, at the tail end of those projects, they're really also going to need land use planning staff. And we wanted to acknowledge the fact that that's also where our staff time is being dedicated. The other elements on this, we did highlight out, and we're going to talk a little bit more detail about the issue papers in a little bit. But the issue papers are indicated by the little pencils and kind of the priority tags, kind of what those topics would be. So that's just an overview of what what a multi-year work program would look like. So the next piece of the recommendation really does have to do with what are the projects in that recommendation? What are we going to do in that multi-year work program? So we've listed those here on the left side of the proposal. And those two also have some neat little color coding indicators. And the colors basically are, if the projects are in black, they're existing projects that are underway or currently on the work program, and then the red ones are new projects moving forward. So that kind of gives you an idea, kind of an easy, kind of quick snapshot. So for the, let's see, I'm just going to flip ahead because did we want to talk about the issue paper? No, we're going to talk about that on the next slide. Okay. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the recommendation related to the transportation long-range planning work projects. So for transportation, actually, we have 7 different projects that are continuing into the next year. These are projects, and again, really are classified in those projects that when we started, we knew they were going to take more than 1 year. So just they aren't here just because they were delayed. We just knew that they were longer work projects, and we have been working on them at some level or another up to this point. So those projects do include the Damascus area transportation needs. We're calling that project the Damascus Mobility Plan. The Arndt Road goal exception. SAPIFA is a really nice code word there, but that is Stafford area preliminary infrastructure feasibility analysis. So each of these, each of these projects are outlined on the existing work program. So the roadie sidewalks, and I'm gonna highlight that particular project because that one was talked about a lot at last year's work program. And on the work program for this year really is to work to identify funding, and we actually anticipate hearing in the next week or so if we were successful at securing immediate response grant from the state to be able to work. So we've been working with the CPO out there to be able to get funding for that. We've been working the Barton Park Master Plan project. Actually, I think they've recently hired a consultant to start that project off. We've just engaged and started working on the Oak Glow Bridge, which is the Oak Grove Lake Oswego pedestrian and bikeway bridge feasibility study. So that one has just been kicked off, and we're working on the transit development plan as well. So all of those are expected to continue on into the next fiscal year for transportation. The 2 new items, one is a transportation future study. This is a priority. We received information both from our Clackamas County Coordinating Committee, who is very much interested in moving forward with this project, as well as the Board of County Commissioners, where it's a fairly expensive project, and it's broad, and it would impact and involve all the different cities. So currently our legislative team over in PGA is advocating for funding through the state legislative session to be able to do that project. So we recommend including that if we receive funding.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
Is that related to C4?
Yes, so the Clackamas County Coordinating Committee, yes, is C4. And then the final project is kind of a very small project, which is really to look at the fee in lieu of construction for sidewalks. Just being able to understand if really the way we're applying that, if there are some small tweaks that need to happen there. Our development review team actually has brought that forward to us and had some questions. So that one is a very small amendment that we would need to do. So we have included it within the project here, the project list. So the next bundle of projects actually are on the land use side. And we're going to start off with the ones that actually are moving forward from this year. Except for the first one that's on there is to add except for adding a yearly minor amendment and time-sensitive ZDO amendment. So that really is this placeholder to acknowledge that we often get directives from the state, from the region, from outside that really requires us to do work. And sometimes they're small, minor amendments, but really the time-sensitive things. So being able to put a placeholder in there for that type of work, as you can see, we've kind of put a placeholder in the last 6 months of each fiscal year to be able to bundle those time-sensitive type projects together. So we also hope to complete the ZDO audit that was underway, but has been delayed a little bit due to staffing changes and kind of rearranging in the planning department. The other items is we are anticipating to complete the Park Avenue Development and Design Standards project, and we anticipate that continuing into next year. And then finally, also completing the short-term rentals in the single-family residential areas, and that's something that has been kicked off, right? And we anticipate being done early into next fiscal year. So this is the piece of the recommendation that really is all about is about the new. It's about what we've heard from the outreach and how we can address these different requests that we've heard. So our proposal is to add an item to update Comprehensive Plan Chapter 8, which is our housing chapter. And we would start that with doing an issue paper that really looks at the items that were brought forward to us that are related to housing, and be able to identify really a kind of a plan on moving forward. So Jennifer was going to talk a little bit more about kind of the issue papers and how these things are expected to be handled.
So good evening, I'm Jennifer Hughes, the planning director. I think we talked about this at your work session in February, but just in case not, I'm giving full credit to Washington County for being the sort of genesis of this issue paper idea. We're stealing it from them because we think it's such a good approach. Part of, I think, the struggle has been is we do this outreach and we get all these ideas, but there really isn't time for us to even evaluate. In some cases, we're not entirely sure what's being asked, right? Somebody's giving us a paragraph summary of what they'd like to see happen, but we're not really sure what the full scope of that is. We don't have a chance to vet. I mean, we've got however many, whatever we said, 29 projects on this list. We haven't really had a chance to evaluate each of these individual pieces. So by grouping them by topics such as housing or economics or natural resources, our thought is then that if you choose a topic, then the first step for us will be an issue paper. So we'll say, hey, we heard from the community, for example, on housing. We have one on our work program, actually our current work program, which was to evaluate the low density residential zoning policies. That's on hold because the board decided to wait to have us move forward on that until the countywide housing needs analysis is complete, and that's due to be done end of May, June at the latest. So that's tabled at the moment, but it's still out there. So we're saying, okay, that's still there. We'll slide that over under housing. Then we've got 3 additional projects. Actually, I think the low density residential zoning policies are actually part of L14 as well, but L14 is larger. So L13, 14, and 15 from your attachment A are all related to housing. We also know that the housing needs analysis is ongoing and there will be recommendations coming out of that. The board has a homelessness and housing affordability task force that is doing work right now that is making recommendations to the board, and one set of those recommendations is going to relate to changes to our zoning ordinance potentially. We also know that the legislature is very active this session on housing-related bills, and it is possible that there will be mandates, not just options, but mandates for the county. There may also be some options regarding some additional accessory dwelling unit provisions in the rural area. So there's things bubbling right now in a number of forums that could ultimately trickle down to us in one way or another. I think the important message from staff is just because we're recommending housing, it doesn't mean that we are saying we recommend every suggestion that's been submitted related to housing. What we're saying is this is a big topic. We need to take all of these pieces, analyze them, come back with an issues paper so you can look at What is the ongoing administrative burden of these changes? What are the legal issues? What are the policy concerns? What type of outreach might be required? And then you and ultimately the board would be giving us direction on, these are the pieces of housing that we want to pursue as an actual package of amendments. And I would see that same type of thing playing out, whether it's economics or natural resources. We're not going to know right off the bat, yes, we're going to do tree preservation in a channel migration zone and new habitat protections and until we've had a chance to really vet those issues and come back to you with some specifics. And so I just kind of want to clarify that just because we've said L13, L14, L15 are all under housing, staff is not necessarily saying, yes, we're going to do every aspect of that. We're saying we're going to look at all of that.
So after you've completed that issues paper, you would then come back as basically another public works session here to look through the issues paper and then your recommendations for what should be narrowed down to be the actual scope of the housing priorities project?
Correct. We wouldn't envision that we would be going back out to necessarily to solicit the level of public input that we've had into the work program in that sense. But certainly it would be a public study session in front of the Planning Commission, a public policy, the board calls them policy sessions in front of the board, to figure out, okay, so this is what we learned about housing. Now, what would you like us to move forward with? And then obviously, if it's anything of any magnitude, it's going to have a public outreach component. If it's something that's mandatory from the state and we just know we have to change these 8 things, that's obviously a very different project.
Thank you.
Just a comment on reading 13 and 14. So just to point it out as I read through this closer, you're going to amend the plan, ZDO, to address the results of the housing needs analysis, which is clearly going to state you need a bunch of housing. Then 14, protect neighborhoods from upzoning and incompatible development. Just pointing out that you've got a conflict and you could probably merge 13 and 14 into one and reconcile that balance is the real goal.
Right, and I think actually maybe in your memo, Karen, you even raised this issue that there are in some cases inherent conflicts between what different organizations or groups are requesting, potentially what's going to come from the state. And so absolutely, that's part of that. We may not be able to do it all. Now, is there a way that we can potentially upzone in places and protect other, quote unquote, protect other neighborhoods? Maybe. Are there design standards? There's ways we may be able to balance those competing priorities.
I would just say that you could get a little bit clearer and those two would not be in direct conflict as you read them. One, there's a need for housing. Two, there's a need to preserve communities where there isn't something bigger than single-family homes. It's just something that's there.
So I think the other piece that I do want to highlight is that we did look out, and as we're trying to understand, looking into the future, what types of projects we should be looking at, we did identify the second priority to be the economics chapter. And that's where the small-scale manufacturing kind of fell in. We know that this is a priority, both to the Planning Commission as well as to the board. We acknowledge that housing needs to come first, but really that's why we're suggesting that we really look at our economics chapter second and looking that out, but that really won't be until fiscal year 21-22. And then the final recommendation that's kind of included on this whole piece of paper is the kind of making a third priority of looking at natural resources. If you look at your attachment A, there were several different proposals related to the natural resources, and many of them actually are kind of high effort. I didn't call this out earlier, but within this attachment A table, we did go through and try to understand and give you an idea of what the level of effort to complete for the different projects would be. And so we recognized that natural resources was an important item to the community, but also they were challenging topics and things that we really would need to wrap our hands around and how we would address those. And that, again, I mean, just even writing that issues paper could take some time so that we can bring something forward to you and then be able to get direction on that. So that kind of completes what that kind of multi-year long-range planning work program would look like.
So to back up, I appreciate you putting the kennels as on the list, but I don't want a greater opportunity, just acknowledgement of, I think, the 8 or 9 that are in the former Damascus area that were very collaborative in a plan, just actually give them a place of actual use in the plan. Hours, noise, that type of basic, because right now there's no mention and they exist, and I'm willing to bet many of them exist without the status and permits that you might need. There's no proof, right? They've been doing it forever. How do you prove that you've got a non-conforming use? You went through a city that doesn't exist. They were very involved in that process, trying to make sure that they existed. That was the one place that the county had nothing. And there are quite a few businesses in that area. So it isn't a greater opportunity, it's just to acknowledge the existing use. You don't need to create new pathways, just allow the people who exist to exist, is all I'd seek.
Okay.
Just to mention that.
So that kind of touches on a question I have. And I'm wondering if you all have given any thought to how do we deal with if somewhere down the road, maybe, so we have this focus on housing. There's something outside of that either is a low-hanging fruit, has some urgency behind it for whatever reason. You could envision all kinds of things that might come up, that don't fit in there, but might make sense for us to do. What's the criteria for, when do we say it's okay to move something in or not, or are we not going to do that? Have you given any thought to how that might work? Does that make any sense?
No, I mean, I think it does make sense. And I think there's a couple of things that I would really highlight there. Is one, that what you're saying does acknowledge the fact that what we're proposing is very different. And what we're proposing is to say, hey, we're going to focus on really one
Solving a
group of
problem.
things topically, right? So it's not like a mix and match menu. It's really, let's see if we can focus on particular items. And so then your question is, well, what if that one little thing really did come in? How could we potentially squeeze that in? So we did have, and I think one of the filter would be whether or not it would fit into this item of yearly minor and time-sensitive ZDO amendments. So each year, we're going to come together, we're going to put together a package of that. Really sticking to how you define minor, right?
Right.
As well as knowing that time-sensitive would raise things up to be able to get packaged within that item. So I think that's the initial direction I'd give. I don't know if you would say anything more than that, Jennifer, but I do think it's going to be interesting to see sort of how this plays out.
Yeah, I mean, I really like the concept in terms of, I think it will make us more efficient and more effective at solving problems. But I also recognize that, just because we're focused on one thing doesn't mean the rest of the county stops, right? And
Right.
how do we deal with
Right.
stuff
I mean,
like
I think the board at their policy session where we talked to them about turning this into a more than, not going out and doing this full process every year. And I was pretty candid. I said, we spend a lot of time doing this that we could actually spend doing the work. And there's a balance, right? Because we're seeing the same projects come up every year because we don't have the time to actually do them.
Right.
So we go out and ask people, but the reality is we can pick off this much of what people want. And I don't see, given the current staffing outlook, that is going to change. So, so we need to, I guess, be realistic and forthright with people about the resources that we have. And so the board was very receptive to switching this to an every 2 years with the idea that we would do a check-in with them, and I would assume that would include a check-in with you in the off year. So, and it isn't as though the work program can't be changed.
Right.
If all of a sudden the board says, look, this is a crisis, we're doing this, then that's what we're doing, and we stop doing housing. It's not binding in the sense like a land use decision would be, where once we have what we have, we kind of, have to move forward with that. So there will be that ability. But I think it's true that even the projects that we think are minor aren't. I mean, the process that's required to amend the code and amend the plan is not simple. It takes a significant amount of staff time. And so every time we choose to, well, we'll just do this one little thing, or we'll just do this one little thing, you're losing that economy of scale that you can gain by wrapping your head around something significant and saying, we're going to pick off these 8 things that all relate to each other. And I think that's what we see as being the advantage of this approach. The disadvantage is, yeah, you're picking that topic, you feel like, oh, I can't, then I can't do these other things I want. But you will, we'll get there.
So for example, I had a question on L18 for the small scale manufacturing.
Correct.
So in the summary in attachment A, it says that the effort to complete from staff is
Whoa.
low.
Right.
So, and it is something that we've looked at as a priority last year and was asked for again this year. Is that the type of thing that could fit under minor? Or how would that particular one be looked at for when it could fit in, if it could be minor earlier?
So potentially, and I think it depends. And I mean, I don't know how far down the rabbit hole you want to go on small scale manufacturing, but some of our commercial zones actually already allow a significant amount of manufacturing. This is not something that is completely foreign to the zoning ordinance that you would have manufacturing in a commercial zone. But there is at least one specific commercial zone where there was some interest in having that ability that doesn't exist currently and in potentially expanding it in another one. If it's as simple as going into a table of uses and saying you can do manufacturing in this zone, that's absolutely minor. What I'm concerned about is that really what the community means? Because trucks, noise, odor, traffic, right? Is that really taking retail space potentially for manufacturing? I feel like there's some issues there that maybe do need to be vetted. So if it's that kind of project, then that I think shifts the conversation a little bit. It's still not a huge scale project, but it may not fit within this idea of we're going to have this sort of basket of 8 or 10 sort of miscellaneous things we throw together for a package each year. And we have had really no discussions as a staff about the small scale manufacturing. That's just kind of my thought process off the top, is that there might be more there than just add it to the table of uses and say you can do it.
The other districts that include it, is it that the other commercial districts actually just include manufacturing period or certain types of, or scales of manufacturing?
It's a broad category. In particular, the two zones that came up when this project first emerged a couple of years ago was general commercial and community commercial. So the general commercial zone exists all along McLaughlin Boulevard between Gladstone and Milwaukee. In that area, manufacturing is a primary use, provided it does not include the primary processing of raw materials. So we end up kind of parsing, at what point is something right? So if I already have flour and I'm gonna add it to sugar and bake something, that's probably not primary processing. If I'm bringing in the wheat and I'm milling the flour, it probably is. Do we care? So that's and it came up specifically in the context of bakeries and breweries. Honestly, that's where this discussion came from. So it's kind of the same thing in the community commercial zone. I don't recall off the top of my head whether there's any manufacturing explicitly allowed, but there was definitely a question as to whether you'd be able to open a brew pub if it was truly brewing beer to sell somewhere else, as opposed to you can obviously come in and have, restaurants and bars and things are permitted in that zone. And so it's that, when have you crossed over and now you're something more than what's permitted in a community commercial. And the community commercial zones do tend to be located more proximate to sort of neighborhoods or little downtown type of areas. And are you going to change the character if you go too far by what you permit in those zones would be my concern.
I suspect we're going to hear some more public testimony about the scope of that, which will be helpful. Yeah, Christine.
Thank you, Chair. So before we get to the public testimony, which I think is coming quickly, I just wanted to mention one more time on the housing portion, when you guys write your issue papers on L13 housing strategies, I really am interested in the connection between that goal of 2,000 new housing units, how people think that's going to be achieved. And I don't think there's a way to really know what your appropriate regulatory changes need to be unless you know where they're anticipating those additional houses will go. And that's, of course, I'm sure going to be in line with L14 when you talk about how that fits in with an existing neighborhood character and all those kinds of things. So I think that question of, if you can get out the crystal ball and have a sense of where it's anticipated that all this new housing is going to land, I think that's about the only way you really do know what kind of recommendations will be in front of us as far as potential appropriate changes.
Right, and I'm hoping that some of that will come from the housing needs analysis.
Yeah.
I don't know the genesis of the 2,000 units, that goal. It's in Performance Clackamas, but it's not a goal that came out of DTD particularly. I think it came out more on the housing provision side from our H3S department. And so I agree with Karen that it's likely that it was anywhere in Clackamas County because the Housing Authority definitely builds and manages affordable housing across, cities and unincorporated Clackamas County. It's also got an end date of 2022, and nothing that we do to
Right.
amend the ZDO at this
Right.
point is going to hit that number with that timeframe. And I expect that the housing needs analysis is likely to show us that we need more than 2,000 units, but it's also pushing it out to a 20-year timeframe, which is a little more amenable to what we would be talking about here about changing codes. But the housing needs analysis should allocate those needs across jurisdictions, so we should be able to determine, at least, nothing's perfect, but some idea of how many of those units are supposed to be ours as the unincorporated county, and how many they think we can build with what we have now. So we should be able to do some math and inform the conversation that way.
Thank you.
Okay, so with that, our next step is to take public input. We do like to remind folks that we're looking for about 3 minutes per person, but that's at your discretion. And then after the public input, there will be a community planning commission discussion, and we'll break it into those pieces outlined above. So I'll pass it back over to you.
Are there any further questions from commissioners for the staff?
There will be,
Yeah.
guaranteed.
So seeing none, we will move into the public testimony period. We always start with representative CPOs, hamlets, or villages. Are any of you representing one of those entities here tonight? Come on forward. Let me see if. Welcome.
Good evening, I'm Leonard Schaber, northwest of the county, Borland Road area, Walker's Corner. I'm representing the Stafford Lower Twelve Valley CPO Chair, and I'm also the Stafford Hamlet on the board. I'd like to speak in favor of two of the items that are on your exhibit list. One specifically, the area notifications that are made to rural unincorporated area when land use applications are put in. Sometimes we get maybe only one notification because the property areas are so large that the current distance requirements preclude giving information to other property owners in the area. So we'd like to see those boundaries increased to, instead of a quarter mile, to half a mile, that area. So that's on L26. The second thing I'd like to speak in favor of is N36, concerning the Stafford Johnson Road improvement question. If you've ever driven Stafford Road from Moreland to Lake Oswego and tried to turn off or onto Johnson Road, up by Charles Road, you'll find it's a very interesting situation, depending upon the time of day. The request is to redesign that entire area to make a Johnson Road northbound right turn only onto Stafford Road, having a traffic circle put in at Childs Road and Stafford Road so that people can make that circle and come back and head south on Stafford Road rather than trying to make a left turn onto Stafford Road from Johnson. There's been a number of very bad accidents there because of traffic heading north on Stafford Road. Posted traffic is 40 miles an hour and they go in excess of that. And that, I usually go through there by 30 to 35, and it's about as fast as I would feel safe and comfortable to do that because of the windy road and the limited sight distance. So those are two of the areas that I'd like to speak in favor of. Thank you.
Okay, so I have a series of cards here. We'll call you up two at a time to come on up to the table. If anyone would like to testify, feel free to fill out another one of these cards and bring it up. We have about 3 minutes. I'm not going to be too strict on that as long as you guys are willing to work with us. So please keep your comments concise and be as brief as you can, and we appreciate your testimony. So let's start with Carl. I can't read your last name, starts with an EX.
EX, I know.
Well, come on up. And Joseph, come on up. Joseph Edge. Welcome, you all. And just so you know, we'll have Mario Mamone and Mark Struloff as next. So go ahead. Thanks.
I'll go ahead and start, I guess. My name's Carl Exner, like I said earlier. I actually am city council on the city of Sandy, and I represent that. We have submitted several projects for this process, probably one of our first times, and so we're trying to figure out just how we fit into the community of Clackamas County, Unincorporated, as part of the city. But we have a couple of projects that we presented that didn't even make the list, and I wanted to kind of put that out there and kind of give you an idea why we presented that, and maybe there's some reconciliation about how that is. And then one of them that did make the list but didn't get on your priority that I think you might want to relook at that for prioritization. So the first one is I'm here to testify in favor of these county projects that we submitted for your long-range work program. For the first one is you titled it as N32, and that is categorized as a capital improvements project, but it really is a planning project. And it's basically Road 362nd from, you got there? Found it? Okay. All right. It's from Highway 211 and 362nd, about a mile, 0.9, into the city of Sandy down to 362nd and Highway 26. It's a piece of road that we have had several folks come to us that are outside the city as well as inside the city that have talked to us about some real problems with that one. The junction at 26 and 362nd is where Fred Myers is, if you're familiar with that piece of property. And that intersection, has been one of those things that ODOT has told us that it fails weekly. We have access to some properties that the county has specified as a economic development area, and it's really one of those things that's holding back a lot of the city's growth. But really from that point back is where we're looking at asking for some help in planning it rather than capital investment. There's a piece just outside of the city to the south. The locals call it Dead Man's Corner. It is a place where it's a very sharp turn and it's a very deep turn off into a couple of folks' property, and regularly we get people that miss the corner and end up into the ditch as well as into these people's houses. That's one of the problems we have on 362nd. And then the other piece is the far end in unincorporated Clackamas County, where at 362nd and 211 junction, people are traveling quite fast there, and they're trying from a dead stop to get into 211, either going back to Sandy or down into Eagle Creek, and it's really become more and more of a problem. So we're hoping in that particular project to get some planning figured out how to solve these fairly high problems with danger, as well as coming into the city where it is a lot of economic development and people are struggling with that driving. So that's the one that we would like to see added on there. Again, I'm not sure that this process is something that we want to see this year, because obviously we didn't make it even on your list, but you're going to see a lot more of this particular project because it is important for folks who are in that area. The second one is N33. If you can find that, I think it's pretty close to the other one that we talked about, and it's called the Furwood Junction on your description. We know it as Shorty's Corner locally. Really a problem. ODOT has tried to do some fixes on that project a couple different times. They put in signage and ballards, and I'm not sure they've fixed it. I think maybe they might have made it worse. But it is a junction that has some real sensitivity to the folks that are in that area. It has Furwood School, a middle school, is just less than a quarter mile away from that. 400 children in that school, plus teachers, plus parents. Almost all of those are exiting out of Shorty's Corner. Really needs to have some sort of planning effort in that. And again, this one sounds like it got put in with the other as far as capital investment. We're not looking for capital investment here. We're looking for some planning to figure out how to make this one better, and then going after whatever we can to get the funding for doing the capital investment in the future. So those two projects are transportation projects that the city of Sandy's really focused on trying to get up on the list. The third one, and it's the final one, and I'll close at this one, is classified as L3. It's your habitat water quality protection item. Had a couple different folks, I guess, submit this one, but for us in the city of Sandy, you may know that, maybe not, that the city is going through a process of planning for our new sewage plant. Pretty big thing for us, lots of money. More than just buildings and pipes. Part of the process of building our sewer plant is we're looking at the green side of this project, and that includes things like habitat improvement, code development to protect those habitats, and streamside and lakeside protection. And that's a process that we're going to do in the next 4 to 5 years to get our sewer plant put into place. And it seems to me that if the county is interested in doing that as well, that there's an appropriate timing to get these things both on the same work plan at the same time, so we don't get in conflict with each other. You know, I can imagine that the things that you might be doing in the county would be very similar to the things that we'd be trying to do in the city, and those would complement each other, I would think. So anyway, those are the 3 projects that we'd love to see us get more attention to, and I hope that if there's any questions, I'd certainly be glad to answer those. But thank you for listening to me, and look forward to doing some more work with you, hopefully, on some of these projects.
Are there questions from the commission? Murph?
Yeah, Carl, you know how many people have been killed on Shorty's Corner?
Oh, man. I tried to find that out. ODOT said they'd get back to me a week and a half ago.
They're still counting.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
And it's always fender benders. It's a T-bone kind of a thing where people are pulling out and they're coming around a blind corner and they can't anticipate the speed. Sometimes people are rounding that corner at 70 miles an hour. You throw in the mix of sand and ice and snow and bad weather, and you can imagine it gets even worse than that. So Shorty's Corner's got a lot of sensitive issues for us. The school really makes it a big thing for us. Again, it's all in unincorporated county.
Karen, do you have any thoughts or comment on, I recognize that most of the work on our work plan are ongoing projects. There wasn't a lot of room to fit in other things. Do you have a sense of whether there's an interest in working some of this in long-term in terms of planning assistance or whatnot?
So, I'm going to turn this back on. So I think that you bring up a good point that kind of was brought up in a similar way when Rhododendron brought forward its project. For transportation projects, there really is a whole spectrum of different different phases. So there's, on one hand, a planning phase, which is this project in the TSP? Have we identified a need and a potential solution, right? And then there is the next phase, which is more design, such as, okay, we know there's a need and we have a potential solution. How do we design for that? So we're in the middle of between planning, where we have identified a need within our transportation system plan, and being able to start design. Do we start to be able to identify what those options are? So right now, I would have to really, and that's why those particular projects fell into not long-range planning, because it would require our capital team to start working on these projects to look at what those design alternatives are, right? But it is something that I can talk with you about afterwards.
Sure.
And really try to figure out, well, how do you start to move the needle on this? How do you start to make these different projects move forward? And a lot of times it is about accessing funding, right? And that's how projects rise to the top, and what are those different funding sources out there that we really can achieve being able to start to address those. Because sometimes also with transportation projects, we are concerned about getting too much into the design without having the full project funding identified, because you don't want to have too many things just designed and then sitting on the shelf. So there's this interesting balance. But so I've always found that really finding how you can start to match that long-term funding for that capital project really moves it off, just our, capital project list.
Sure. And in our case, both of these projects are something we've been watching, and we've been trying to get funding through the ODOT venue.
Mm-hmm.
We've been trying to do funding through some of our own dollars. A lot of these are outside our city limits, but not completely out of our UGB. So we have some possibility of getting some construction dollars, but it's the planning that really bothers us, really gets us stumbled because we don't have the people, we don't have the money for those kind of planning. So start someplace. Hopefully we can get some on the line. So appreciate your attention.
Well,
Go ahead.
I was just going to offer a couple quick thoughts. One, so I live in Boring, and I'm always excited to have folks in the city of Sandy here because I think it's important for folks to understand that while Sandy is on kind of the east edge of the county, it is a huge resource for that area. Even from everything from its library to Fred Meyer or whatnot, I'm going into Sandy every day. You've got folks from the mountain coming down to Sandy and using those resources, Barton, Eagle Creek. It's not just the city of Sandy. It has a very large impact on that whole area of the county. And so whatever we can do to help move some of these projects forward, I think they have a lot bigger benefit than just the city of Sandy. The other piece of this, and I know we've talked about in the past, Karen, is this is another example where our road patterns are having a significant effect on our rural school. And it comes back to, I really think that we need to figure out how to prioritize in the county how we have some sort of rural safe routes to school standards and protocols, because we've had that issue in Damascus. You're seeing it in Furwood. We need to get a handle on the safety issues of rural
Absolutely.
schools in the county.
Yeah. And certainly we'd be willing to provide whatever we can to make this one move forward. A lot of folks talk to us about the problems at Shorty's when you get all these parents coming out with their kids. I don't want to see anybody get in a big accident, but there are lots of accidents in Shorty's Corner. It happens.
Just a matter of time.
Yeah. Don't want to have anybody get killed.
Yeah, and I suggest go there on a Saturday morning and try and pull out of Shorty's Corner.
Right.
I don't care which way you're going, either left or right. And yeah, you're risking your life. 211, I just came through it. I'll go through it again when I go home. It's always been a super hazard area and is growing. I see there's quite a bit of groundbreaking right now going on with more expansion. Yeah, so it's just going to increase. As far as L3, I'm already involved in that, and I
Yes.
keep these guys updated with what's going on.
You're going to see me here again.
I hope
City of
so.
Sandy is going to be doing more and more of this watershed habitat improvement and the code involvement. In fact, I'm involved in it right now with the cities. We're doing some code improvements in those areas already. So as we move along through this, next 5 years, you're going to see more and more of us in this area. So appreciate it.
Thank
Don't
you.
take too
Thank
much
you
more
very
time.
much. And before we move to Joseph, I apologize to the commission. I didn't give an opportunity for questions for Leonard. I don't know if anyone had any other additional comments. If we do, we can bring them back up, catch things later. So everybody's okay. Joseph, thank you. Thanks for your patience.
Good evening, Chair Pasco and Planning Commissioners. My name is Joseph Edge, and I'm here to represent the Oak Grove Community Council, as well as the North Clackamas Urban Watersheds Council. And I can respond to any questions that you may have about any of the projects submitted by either of those two councils. The first thing I'd like to do is thank staff for promoting our public art program request from an N35, I think it was, up to L25. Because I was able to submit supplemental comments about how this is impacting our community right now. We have a land use approval for a self-storage warehouse in the heart of our community in Oak Grove. And one of the in order to satisfy the development standards, one of the conditions of approval was to install a mural on one of the blank walls. Well, we don't have a public art program or public art standards or guidelines or anything. And so this has been kind of a harrowing experience over the last year and a half, where we've been trying to, coordinate and motivate with the developer and motivate the developer to to follow through on this in a way that really engages the public. And they are about 2 months away from seeking their final occupancy permit. And they are just now starting to get involved in conversations with us. And the Clackamas County Arts Alliance has declined to provide guidance because the timeline is too short, because they didn't get involved earlier, because there's no standards. So, these kinds of things are important in our communities, and and part of the one of the things that I also wanted to thank staff for is is really the 5-year forecast. Being able to kind of look at this out for a multi-year work program and to see kind of how things are going to line up over the next few years. It's really helpful to me to know that we're not just, yelling into the abyss, but we're actually, there's a roadmap that we can follow to get there. But similarly, with to L25, L18, I think it is, small-scale manufacturing or bakeries and brew pubs, as we refer to it in our community, legalized bakeries and brew pubs. Yes, they are to an extent allowed to be legal, but there's some distribution issues. And in speaking with potential investors who are actively scouting sites in our community, but uncertain if they will be able to develop something that will pencil for them economically, because distribution is part of, even just local distribution is part of the essential formula for successful local brew pubs and local bakeries. They distribute to cafes, or they distribute to local bars, or the local grocery store with bottled or baked goods. And so in C2, in our community commercial, the sites where in historic downtown Oak Grove, which is where these investors are really looking to get into our community, they don't have these opportunities because they can't distribute at all. And they also cannot do any primary processing of raw materials, even if they were up on McLaughlin Boulevard, because of that rule. And that involves, barleys and malts and yeasts and those kinds of raw materials that would have to be processed into, alcoholic beverages. So anyway, these are when I look out at it's going to be 2 more years before we're talking about writing an economics issue paper and getting into the work of these economic projects. That's a long time, and that's a long time for our community to sit with these investors, kind of unable to do anything. And so what I was hoping is that maybe there is a nearer term, kind of a meet halfway point, which is maybe allow some of these manufacturing uses or these distribution uses or primary processing raw materials uses as conditional uses that require a conditional use review. And that would, you're changing the letter code and the use table from, restricted to conditional. And then, it requires a more staff time for a more thorough review. But at least you're looking at the use in its context and seeing, how it satisfies the comprehensive plan policies and really interfaces with the community in that specific location. And so I feel like there's opportunities there for, kind of helping things along without necessarily waiting until we can really get into, and there may be other issues that really deserve a thorough look, as Karen had pointed, or as Jennifer had pointed out, and that's completely fair. But as a conditional use, you get to do that on a case-by-case basis, and the hearings officer would make the decision. And so I think that that's an attractive halfway point. And the Planning Commission is permitted by the ZDO to initiate Type 4 processes, which would amend the, which is how you amend the ZDO. And so you could absolutely propose something like that as a group. Staff doesn't have to take it on necessarily, but at least you let them know that that's one of your priorities, perhaps. And with that, I think I'm happy to let the rest of our letters kind of speak for themselves. I'll respond to any questions that you may have about any of the projects that we've requested.
Thank you, Joseph. Mark?
I've actually got a question for staff. You just made me think about something. With distribution and delivery is there any restriction on that commercial use to allow for distribution if they're cooking? It's just the bigger factory food processing is really what that restricts, right? That's what you're seeking to get to the bottom of.
So the code doesn't, I would say that arguably the code does restrict any kind of, if you are making a product and then distributing it, it falls more under the industrial than it does under the commercial. But again, it depends. If you're catering a lunch at somebody's office because you have a deli, we're not going to say that that's an industrial use. But if you're packaging sandwiches by the hundreds and shipping them out to Safeway for just, then that
Or
probably
Blue
is.
Apron.
So there's a line somewhere, and the code isn't necessarily clear on where that
You're
line
gonna
is.
want to put on the long range, Postmates, Amazon, that type of Uber Eats. You're gonna want to put that in the code because it's coming. And Blue Apron and those others are looking for local restaurants to package. And there's a lot coming with that right now that you read about in the business magazines. And it just clicked off. You might want to, because in 2 years you'll be there, right? When it's on so you want to look at food distribution by third party something or other. So it's just like Airbnb only for food delivery. Just a thought that you sparked in my mind.
Christine, sorry.
Thank you, Chair. So Joseph, I'm still stuck and bummed on your public art program not getting off the ground easily for you. And I just didn't know if you had tried Americans for the Arts, Oregon Arts Commission, other folks that already have best practices and, like just grab and go kinds of ways for you to navigate that process.
So we initially reached out to the Regional Arts and Culture Council and then also reached out to the Clackamas Community Arts Alliance. And, they both have best practices and muralist guides and things. And so we've been able to do some of that, but we don't have someone to oversee the process. It's really loosey-goosey. All they really have to do is satisfy the requirement of putting some paint on the wall. And I think that'll be good enough, to meet the requirements. And so, we're working with them to try to, get them to have a committee of volunteers from the community who are willing to help with the artist selection and, and all of that. But it's still, it's completely up to the developer to how they choose to leverage that or not. But thank you for your suggestions. I will continue to pursue a favorable outcome.
And Estacada has an amazing mural program going there. I'm sure that they'd be a resource too. I mean, there's lots of great ways to get that really structured in a functioning way. So
Thank you.
Other questions? I will just say that this has come up a couple years in a row now. I think not to get too theoretical, but when you think about how you get things done, typically experts will say you pick off the low-hanging fruit and deal with the harder stuff later, right? And it strikes me that this is something that we could and should do here, of having a conversation with Joseph and his community about how do we narrow down the scope of this to allow some of these investor projects to move forward, and how do we get it in a format that would make sense for a minor, time-sensitive kind of thing, and then defer the trickier, harder stuff for 2 years down the road when we go to that economics paper. It just strikes me that, we'll have another discussion about this, but, every time we delay something like this, we're setting opportunities aside, and I think we've got to figure out how to move some of these things forward where we can. So I would encourage you, Joseph, to think about what does the community really need? What are these investors really after? How do we narrow down the scope that we can allow those smaller things to start to move forward, recognizing that we'll deal with the bigger, broader issues and, down the road.
Yeah, and I didn't bring it with me, but I have a technical, kind of a white paper from, one of these investors to describe kind of what they see as the limitations and constraints of the existing code and how it would impact their ability to have an operation that really, met all of the.
Definitely share that with us. I would be interested to see it.
Okay,
So,
glad to.
thanks so much.
Thank you.
So we'll keep this moving along. Thanks, everyone, for their patience. Now we have Mario and Mark. Come on up. And we have, after that is Bruce, and that is the last card that I have. So if anyone else would like to testify, we've got another one up here. I'll get that from Darcy. So, Mario, go ahead. Thank you.
Good evening to each of you. Thank you for this opportunity to address you. I'm here in support of project or exhibit number 12, Project L19. And that's to extend the operating hours of marijuana dispensaries in unincorporated Clackamas County. The reason we asked for this change is when we first opened up, and I was involved in the commissioners, working with the Planning Commission and Mike McAllister, setting up the original ZDOs with operation, place, time, and manner restrictions. And at that time, we were the only dispensary in the entire county, city and unincorporated county, and that's Maritime Cafe. We're located in McLaughlin Boulevard. I should mention that I also live in Westland, and we've operated Maritime Cafe since 2011. We went through the planning department at that time and got a conditional, not a conditional use permit, but an occupancy permit to have the dispensary. At that time, we were opening at 10 o'clock and we were closing at 9 in the evening. So the county just adopted those hours, which was fine with us. There was no other competition at that time. Well, since then, there's been many cities in the county that have dispensaries now, and there's about 14 other dispensaries besides the 5 that are in unincorporated Clackamas County. And they all open around 8 o'clock or earlier, and they close at 10 o'clock at night. So we're asking that the county change that one little line in the ZDO that just is the time that we are able to operate, to put us on the same financial operating field as all the other dispensaries. In addition to that, we might be the only project that's being proposed now that actually will generate revenue for the county. Right now, we pay a 3% sales tax, and that money comes to the county. Operating longer time will allow us to get more customers and more revenue to the county that's right now is going to the cities. So people drive by to our places and go to Oregon City to shop, or Southeast Oregon, or Southeast Portland, excuse me. We believe that we fit right in to the staff recommendation of yearly minor and time-sensitive ZDO amendments. In 2014, when the county looked at having a moratorium on the dispensary, there was a significant amount of staff time put on that project at that time to put the moratorium on the dispensary. I see this as a very minor thing. There shouldn't be any opposition to it. All the dispensaries are in commercial zones. We're generally adjacent to other businesses that open before us and close after us. So we don't see much problem with that community rejecting that proposal. Let's see. We think it's a fairly simple process, and I mentioned that having worked with the Forest Service for 30 years in planning, we did 1-year, 5-year, 10-year, 20-year plans, and some of them were quite simple and didn't need an environmental impact statement, maybe an EIS, that we could move out of the real quickly. We hope that we fit into that category. Again, I don't have your job, but I do know that with less money, you do less work. And I know working in planning that management always had a long laundry list of projects they would want. The general public had a long laundry list of projects they would want, but we were only budgeted so much money. Again, we hope that you could see that for us, this is an economic issue, a business issue, and an important one for the 5 dispensaries in unincorporated Clackamas County. And with that, I want to thank you for listening to me, and if you have any questions, I'd be glad to answer them.
Any questions, Murphy?
What are the OLCC requirements for openings?
They are, I believe, from about 7 to 10.
So you're within that.
Well, we open at 10 and we close at 9.
Yeah, so what you're asking is within the OLCC.
Oh, it's within OLCC rules,
Yeah,
correct.
okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And the only reason, again, if I might mention, this rule came in because we were the only dispensary in the county, and that's our operating is at that time, and so that's what was adopted.
Mario, I will be brutally honest with you.
Uh-huh.
I think I agree with you that it probably fits within this small, minor amendment. It doesn't seem like it's a big deal. I will say that we have a county commission that is a little burnout on marijuana, just from the conversations that I've had with them. And it's just because they're of the mindset of, we've spent a lot of time and resources on creating these regulations. Maybe we need to let them sit for a little bit to figure out when to move next. So I only say that to say, I would encourage you to have conversations with the county commissioners and make them understand why it's important to you, because that's what will drive whether this ends up as a small minor amendment or not. Certainly have those conversations. It's a little, I would love to tell you that we have the power to make that happen, but you need to talk to some other folks in the county to move that forward. I encourage you to do that.
I appreciate that. I did send a letter to each of the commissioners back in December. I haven't called them yet, but I will. I know some of them personally because we worked with them through all of those years. I know there's some new members now since the elections. But I said, thank you for that. But I would still love to have the support of this body in whatever fashion it makes recommendations for projects.
Certainly encourage you to actually have some meetings with them. I think that will make a big difference.
All right, thank you.
Forgetting who's next. Welcome. Mark.
Hi, good evening. I'm Mark Struloff, and I'm a third-generation farmer in the Karas area of Oregon City. And I'm here tonight to speak to L26, which is to request that the land use notification distance in rural areas be increased from 750 feet to 1/2 mile. This issue came to my attention when I learned that a huge industrial marijuana grow and processing facility consisting of 89 structures had already been approved on 26 acres at 15171 South Spangler Road in the Karas area. I live directly north of this facility on Karas Road and was not notified of this application because of the 750-foot limit. A business of this nature that affects the larger community with many negative aspects, such as increased traffic, noise, offensive smell, increased crime, etc., should have been notified by the wider community. Due to the large lot size in our area, there were only a few neighbors that were notified, so very few of us knew of this application approval. My family has lived on Karas Road for well over a century and value the rural nature of our farmland and the peaceful community environment that provides a quality of life that we all enjoy and value very much. When I learned of this facility, that it was approved without any notice, I was surprised and upset. The legalization of recreational marijuana was passed in Oregon by the urban voters, not by the rural voters. And the classification of marijuana as a farm crop, allowing it to be placed on our EFU farmland, was approved by our legislators, not the rural voters of Clackamas County. So I realized that expanding the notification area to more neighboring properties will be more work for the staff, but in the long run, it also engages and respects the neighboring property owners' rights to have a voice in the changes that are made in their communities, which is part of the comprehensive plan public outreach goals. To help maintain our wonderful rural community and the quality of life it affords, I humbly ask you to extend the notification distance to 1/2 mile in rural areas. Thank you.
Questions from the commission?
I have a question. How many, besides yourself, how many other residents in your area would have been affected by this if you would have increased it to 1/2 mile?
I would estimate 50 property owners.
So this has come up numerous times. I want to start, I fully agree with you. We've had this issue in the past where we have, subject matter aside, we have, issues happening in the rural community and a relatively small number of people get noticed based on the way our notification rules are. And I think we recognize that as an issue we've talked about in that past. The question, Jennifer, is now that we're focusing on issues, where does stuff like this fit in? And how would we move something like this forward?
Well, so technically, I guess there's different ways. One, if we were going to categorize it based on the comp plan, it's under the community involvement chapter, which is listed, I think, in your table. That's where I think it's 26, is categorized. Changing the notice distance, just the actual act of changing the code, is not a big deal at all.
How you define it.
It's a minor amendment. That's not a problem. But the problem is the ongoing administration of that.
Right.
And
Which
the
is why
question.
we've never done anything
It's
about
that
it.
weighing out, right? I mean, and it's hard for me to have this conversation because I recognize that people are passionate about the
Yeah.
issue, and I don't want to discount that. The reality is that most of these controversial applications, and obviously there's no way to prove this one way or the other, but what generally happens is that word of mouth does result in people finding out because people are upset. So they tell the neighbor who tells the neighbor who tells the neighbor, or the CPO gets involved. You hear about it at your kid's school, or you hear about it at church, or you hear about it at work. So our sense has been, at least anecdotally, that these ones that become the sort of poster children for increasing the notice distance actually have had a huge amount of public involvement. And I do want to be clear, though, the Spangler Road, the one this gentleman's talking about, there's two different issues. They had a marijuana grow. We do not do notice for marijuana grow applications, period. They are type 1 land use applications. They are ministerial. The standards are clear and objective. So there isn't any notice whether you're in whatever zone you're in. If you're proposing to grow, it's a type 1 permit. So there was nobody notified. They also had a processing application. That is a type 2. In that case, we follow the distance. So it's either depends on the zoning, but in this case, the 750 feet that was mentioned. So there's potentially two different requests embedded here. What was submitted through the outreach process and what's on the table is to increase the notice distance in rural areas. And then it depends on whether in natural resource zones it's 750 feet, in rural residential zones it's 500 currently. The 500 exceeds state law, the 750 matches it. The county already notifies more than we are required to because we do a pre-notice and a notice of decision. The statute only requires the notice of decision. So we do, in essence, over-notify. But our distances for the ag and forest zones are at the 750, which is the state minimum. So in that case, we're not exceeding. But for marijuana grows, they're type 1, there is no notice whatsoever. That's a completely different request. That would be changing the character of those applications, and it would really change the complexion of how we process marijuana grows.
Christine?
Thanks, Chair. So if the notice were to be changed only for the natural resource zones, cost-wise and administratively speaking, has anybody ever looked at what might be a reasonable expansion of that zone and what the balance between administration and cost would be to expand it at all?
So not in that sort of comprehensive way. I did, because this issue came up and one of the commissioners asked me to look at it, and I'm sorry, I should have brought it downstairs and I don't have it with me, but this is not scientific. We randomly pulled like 4 applications and just looked at what if we went from what it really was, what the current standard is, to a quarter mile or a half a mile, which were the 2 options that were posed to me by the commissioner. And it's completely dependent on which piece of property, because if you're in a highly parcelized area, then the bigger that distance gets, the more notices you're sending out. So, and don't quote me on this, but in those 4 applications, it resulted in anywhere from about a 25% increase in the number of notices to something like a 6-fold increase in the number of notices. And so it's just going to be very dependent on the specific piece of property. And I think the question is, we have several hundred applications a year that fall within those zones. If we do rural residential and natural resources, probably about 400 applications a year that we'd be increasing the notice on. So you're talking about, the cost of the postage and the cost of the staff time. And that's a much bigger concern than the act of amending the zoning ordinance. That part's simple because, yes, we can package it with something else. We already get people saying, why did you tell me about this? I'm far away from it. I don't care. My neighbor has their rights. In other words, we kind of get beat up on both sides. We didn't get enough notice, or why are you wasting your money sending this to us? And so I think it would also be a question of, is this all applications? Because the vast majority of rural applications are a mobile home temporary 2 or 3 year permit on a renewal cycle for care. Home-based businesses, dividing property into 2 or 3 lots consistent with the zoning. It's a lot of them are relatively minor and don't have impacts that anybody would construe to be a half a mile, I think, from the piece of property. So it might be a matter of trying to decide which applications rather than all of them. And I think we would want to consider that because maybe it's only, conditional use permits and large-scale subdivisions and things that we think might have wider concern.
Is there some form of digital application tracking that's publicly accessible? And if so, does that let you sign up for notifications?
So we have not explored in any depth the possibility of signing up for notifications, but that might be a more efficient way to do this. There is digital. Our system is not ideal. I believe it's actually going to potentially be getting somewhat better. So that may be easier, but you can go online and look for applications. Yes, it's possible. It's not as intuitive as we would like it to be. CPOs, of course, that's what typically over the years, that's been the response. If you have asked the planning department, it's then join your CPO, they get notified of everything. But we do have a lot of CPOs that are inactive, or they're active for a while, they become inactive, so that's not always the perfect answer. The possibility of signing up for some sort of an email blast, we could certainly look at that. And given where the world is moving, that might be a better use of our resources than notifying people, by mail. Because the reality is most of those don't get responded to, get tossed. I mean, we know that's what happens, so we're kind of blasting out all these notices for a very small return, and there might be a better way to do that, so.
I totally agree with the complexity of this issue. I totally agree that some projects don't really merit the notification, others probably do. I know there have been times in Boring where, like quarter mile down the road, someone doesn't get noticed for a pretty significant project, right? So I do think that it is time we recognize that our notification system may need some amendments for people in the rural part of the community, and we just need to figure out how we get that in the work program in some way.
Yeah, so if you were inclined to just increase the notice distance, that would, I believe we could do that as part of the minor amendments. But I do think
But it doesn't necessarily solve the
internally,
problem.
we're going to have to look at what that means for us on the back end. What type of increased administrative cost is involved, and is there a more efficient way we could do this?
Yeah,
The county's already announcing on next door. And is that a sufficient way to
Well, it
perhaps
would
put
certainly
those
be
word out?
another way we could potentially do that. And I just don't want to overcommit. I'm pretty sure our public and
Get it.
governmental affairs staff person is sitting in the room right now. It might have a lot of thoughts about it, but we can certainly, I think there are ways we could evaluate whether there's more efficient ways we could let people know. And people who are interested would have that opportunity. I think you're balancing that against the reality that in a lot of cases, people don't care until it's next door, literally, right? That's when it matters. And that's sort of that struggle of we tell people stay involved, but they don't care until it's happening and it's going to affect. I understand that from my own personal, right, situation.
Let's give Mark the
How do we-
last word.
I think I agree with basically, sending out notices for every minor little request. I think the huge industrial marijuana grow that I referred to is way on the other end of the scale. And it affects a huge, neighborhood, community, traffic. I mean, this situation, they were going to tanker truck in water, tanker trucks down 213 onto a small country road. So it's just, so anyway, if there could be modified to be able to notify applications that have huge effects, that would be fine, in my opinion. So, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So we have Grover is the last card that I have. Come on up. Is there anyone else here that would like to testify tonight? Come on up. Make sure that you fill out a card just so Darcy has it.
Bruce, you called his name already. Call my name right.
I'm sorry.
That's
My
all
fault.
right.
It's buried in my list. So we have Bruce and Grover. Is
Yeah.
anyone else in the audience interested in testifying tonight? Great. Thank you. Why don't we start with Bruce?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for hearing me and all the work you guys do. Appreciate it a lot. I've only lived in Oregon for 3 years, but I love it here and made it my home. And I guess looking at this, all your plans here, the one thing that stands out to me is L6, solar. And it's medium on your level of completion or effort, or however you want to put it. And I think it should be the highest effort. And that's what I want us to talk about. And I think that I'm looking at putting solar, I have a few houses. I'm looking at putting solar on all of them. But I'm looking at the costs of it, looking at the permitting process and how cumbersome it is. And I would recommend that you guys start to look at how to streamline that. If somebody from the private sector wants to put their money into putting solar on their house, you should make every effort to help them do it, whatever that takes. And, you know, the application process is a big one. And I don't know what you need to do to have that happen. I don't know what the process is to make that happen. But I can tell you this, if you made it happen and more people put in applications and it went through faster, you would have a lot more money generated, more people doing it rather than making it a cumbersome process and an expensive process. Because that's what we want to do. Next 5, 10 years, we have to get solar on a lot of houses and let the public do it. Break down the barriers. That's all I have to say about it.
Couldn't agree more.
So what's the process to do that, to get that to happen?
So like, I don't know if it's been 1 or 2 years, but staff totally streamlined the solar code. I think your concern is just building code's complex. But staff actually went from like 5 pages down to like 1 page. They did a whole lot of streamline. Everybody supports what you're trying to do. Mm-hmm. It's just you're talking about engineering and load-bearing weight and a whole bunch of other things that in the modern world takes a bunch of stuff to get signed off on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Would you say that's your experience, or?
Yeah, I mean, the engineering part of it is, the panels are getting lighter and lighter, actually, so the engineering issue is going to be going away as the years go on. Their panels are half the weight of what they were 3 years ago.
I agree.
So as far as that part, that should be streamlined also, as we should be able to put that through.
You'll never get away from needing an engineer stamp if it's over a certain size. We have real earthquake concerns where you have anything over 300 pounds has to have engineering attached with it, anchoring. There's a whole bunch that goes on that precedes us with fire marshals and state building code, right? We're there with you. I'm just telling you that we're following rules that are put to us that make it that complex.
Well, I'm not talking about just on houses. I'm talking about on land, on the ground.
You have the same type of anchoring requirements.
Yeah, but you don't have the same structural issues as far as your engineering structural.
You have to have an expert say that meets a code.
I understand. That's my point.
Yeah.
The ground, it's on the
for
ground.
something the size of the table you're sitting on, I have to pay an architect and an engineer several $1,000s to say that meets what you say it does. That's just the way the world works now.
Okay.
So I agree with you. I'm just telling you that we're not the ones who are doing that.
Okay. Thank you.
So I think the point, though, so speaking as someone who has solar panels on my house, I think we've done a lot in the last few years to streamline getting panels on individual houses. I think the scope of what was in this proposal is more thinking about small-scale community solar and how do we start to move those things forward. It's obviously a lot more complex. Maybe it falls into some of this housing work. Maybe it falls in the economic development stuff. I think it comes down to the county can't do everything at once, and we've got limited staff resources. Not that it's not
Right.
important.
So Germany is the one that's doing the most of this kind of solar in a community type thing, where a lot of the different people own the solar together. I'm sure maybe you know about that. Of course you do. So I would try to like try to mimic that it's the example's already there. They're already doing it. So we behoove us to just like go and see how they're doing it and try to copy it rather than try to create the whole thing from scratch.
And I think this is an example where when people want things to, like this to move forward, it's really helpful for people in the industry and people who engage in the community to get together to think about what is really needed from a policy perspective to make these things happen and get them boiled down into a coherent policy paper that the staff and the county commissioners and commissions like this can get their head around, say, yes, these are the things that we need to do. Because a lot of this problem comes around in getting to that point of figuring out what the big picture problems are. And when, whether it's, things like commercial manufacturing and whatnot, the clearer we can be about what is really needed, it makes it easier for government to move things forward.
Okay.
So,
Thank you.
thank you.
Mr. Chair,
Yes.
a little bit of information for you on talking about solar for residential. We have a prescriptive path that is a lot simpler. If it's prescriptively designed, the building process can be streamlined for residential solar. So there's some options, and I'd be happy to give you my contact information so I can help you with that. There's also a solar, there's going to be a solar workshop here. It's going to be held on May 20th. It's going to bring together partners from the sustainability community, some developers, looking at grants and things that can help you get solar in other locations. So that's another avenue to help you get some information that you're looking for. We've done quite a bit of streamlining on the solar process for residential, and it can be done pretty quickly.
So with that, as far as that's concerned, I guess also part of it is getting the word out to the community or the county, people in the county, that this is happening May 20th. How do we promote that so more and more people come to that?
Yeah, exactly. We just got the date set for this workshop, and I know we just started doing some outreach. So I'm a little bit ahead in sharing this information, but I thought it'd be relevant for what you were
Thank you.
speaking on today.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Grover. Thank you.
My
for
name
your
is Grover
patience.
Bornefeld, and I live in Jennings Lodge. And I actually want to echo what I heard a few minutes ago, or at the beginning. This is a great piece. I'm really pleased about it. And I also want to thank you all for all the work that you put into this. This is not the first time I've testified before you. And I know from the last time, I felt a great degree of support in what we did. And we actually ended up changing the auxiliary dwelling unit requirements, et cetera. And so thank you for that. What I want to speak to is, on this 5-year plan, you didn't include L5 and L7. And I happen to be on the Jennings Lodge CPO board, but I am not here representing them. I just know that we have repeatedly put those in as requests. And I want to use a specific example. The comprehensive plan makes a big deal about the importance of open space, saving the environment, et cetera, and it's dated 2001. And I've lived here for 28 years, actually 29 years in August, and we have been fighting the same fight. I live 4 blocks from the former Jennings Lodge campgrounds. 16 acres, 326 trees are gone, it's leveled now, and they're gonna put 72 houses in there. But they opted not to do what's being called for in L5, and there still is no teeth in that. There was also the project on Concord Oaks, also, all those trees are gone. Same in Linden Lane. That's our community. In the next 20 years, I've lived here more than 20 years, they're expecting 100,000 people more to come into Clackamas County. And if we don't protect the resources as the comprehensive plan was designed to do originally, it says, it specifically names our area by identification as being woefully underserved and in need of support. And since 2001 until now, it still hasn't happened, and the teeth, because when the developer said in this very room that it's not feasible to follow ZDO 102.04, they just said it's not feasible. And so that was it. Nothing was done. 326 trees gone, ground leveled, as opposed to we're requesting that it be required. that they follow some of those recommendations. They didn't do any. They just said it's not feasible. There was no rebuttal. There was no requirement that they proved that they couldn't do the same 72 houses on that same piece of property and save trees. They just didn't do it. And so all I'm asking is, in the next 20 years, are there going to be any trees to save? That's my biggest concern, because I've watched the last 20 years, grove after grove, and that's why it includes L7 as well. So that's all I really want to say. I appreciate the work you do. I don't expect to make a big difference in it tonight, but I want to raise that concern. Thank you.
Are there environmental overlays in the Clackamas plan? Like if someone basically voluntarily restricted their land for future development to protect certain trees, is that allowed?
We wouldn't prevent a volunteer, if somebody wanted to voluntarily put a conservation easement or that would be private. We wouldn't get involved in that. But we do have overlays as well.
Yeah.
I mean, regulatory overlays, but not specifically for trees in and of themselves. We do for, if it's like stream buffers and those
Yeah.
kinds of things, but.
So you have the ability in your community to get people to voluntarily give those? Have you considered that, or do you think that would work at all?
Well, so let me make sure I understand what you're saying. So we'll use the example of the Jennings Lodge campgrounds. 16 acres, belonged to a nonprofit since 1903, and they decided to sell it. The county declined to take it. We won't go there. That was just a big deal. But so it was sold to a developer. So now it's in the hands of the developer. Would that follow over to the new owner?
So in 1998, long before this was ever thought, you're a community, you all care. Hey, would you mind putting an easement up so we know that this is protected, this buffer for future, regardless of what you do? Would you be willing to do that now when the stakes are low? So as you go to your community, this was talked about in Damascus where people would give that up to guarantee they allowed for certain types of nature to exist. So you're putting the onus on us to go through an involved process to take the value of people's lands, which is definitely a good thing to do, and I bet it will happen. But I'm just saying right now, you don't need us. If you are a community and you all agree this is a good idea, your neighbors can already begin to restrict their land to protect, for that type of use, if that makes sense. So if someone's got a half acre, they can make sure a quarter of that acre stays open space. A neighbor next to them could do the same. Does that make sense?
Well, but if they sell the property, does that restriction go with it?
It's an easement to maintain open space and trees and nature and certain types. So it's kind of like a voluntary code change on your own land.
Okay. It would not have solved any of the issues that I brought up, but I appreciate that.
Why wouldn't have?
Well, how would it have saved it on the Jennings Lodge campgrounds? They had no interest in it whatsoever. They just owned it and loved it,
That
and then
was
they
the
wanted to
buyer.
sell it, huh?
It's that when they owned it and they loved it and they remember the community and you wanted to preserve part of that to make sure it was a park forever, they wouldn't have done that.
No. They wouldn't even speak to us.
All right.
I'm sorry, they were quite,
Well, I always just find it interesting when people say that the government should basically lock up people's land. You should start asking your neighbors about it now. Because you'd be surprised, some people might be interested as a community to make that effort to create that patchwork of nature.
well, not to disagree with you, but let's use exactly what 1002.04 says.
All right.
It gives a whole long list of 12 or 13 things that could be done.
Yeah.
They didn't opt to do any of them.
Beautiful.
And there's no requirement to do any of them. They did
Then-
what they know how to do best. They scraped the entire land clear. They made it all level. They took out all the trees, and then they built on
Tell
it.
me about the land you own.
Okay, I live on a third of an acre.
All right. So why don't we put an easement over your property to preserve that?
I only have 4 trees.
That's a great start.
Yeah.
You should go first. All
Okay.
right, I'll stop.
I will just tongue in cheek say that I share your skepticism about whether the trees are going to be there in 20 years, but I hope they'll be there still in 2022 when we take up the natural resource components, and this will probably be a great fit for that.
Okay, good.
I think that's just realistically where we are. I think no one disagrees that these things are important. It's a priority process. And we've got it. I think the beauty of this longer term plan is that we have an earmark for when we can take that up. It's just going to be a little bit of a wait.
So I'm missing though, because I do not see in any of this when that is, it's listed here, but it doesn't make the next 5 years,
So
if
it-
I read
it
these
looks
charts
like the
correctly.
natural resources priorities will be in
L5?
22, 23. So if you look at this chart, the next couple of years, next year, we're focused on housing, and then we move in theory to economics, and then after that would be the natural resources area, where this would be a perfect fit for that.
Okay, so this area up here that you're referring to, this could be included in it, but we don't know that it is, and that's 5 years from now
Yeah,
at the soonest.
It's 3 years from now, right?
Right.
So it's not too long, it's not too far away. It's farther than you would like, but it presumably opens the door for just such this type of proposal.
Okay.
To fall into that.
Right, so we didn't list each of the individual project numbers for the that sort of the outlying years, but our expectation was that everything that we have on this list that's classified under natural resources and energy, which is everything from L1 through L11,
Eventually finds a
would at
spot.
least be discussed
Yeah.
at that point.
Right.
I mean, I'm not, as I said in the beginning, it doesn't mean all 11 are going to happen, but they would be vetted at that point as part of a holistic look at our natural resource and energy protections that we have in our code.
Starting with that white paper.
Correct.
Great.
Yes.
And that's all I really want to do. I want to thank you for the work you do, and I want to put a plug for, keep it on the table.
Right, we appreciate that. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for your public testimony. We really appreciate it. It is 8:20. Why don't we take a 5-minute break, and then we will come back and carry out our deliberations. Does that sound good to everyone?
Sure.
Thank you.
Yes.
So we are back to order. We have closed the public testimony. We are moving into deliberations. So what we are tasked with is presenting a recommendation to the county commission regarding the long-range work plan. And so what I think that we should do, as we typically do, is just kind of take people's pulses of where they're at, maybe identify places where we might want to amend or not amend the staff proposal, and we can kind of go from there.
Start
Murph,
at
would
that
you
end.
Mark,
Start
do
with
you
Mark.
wanna have thoughts?
Well, I failed to reapply, so I'm not going to tie you with my opinions. But I do believe that anytime you have a lot of uses that aren't acknowledged within the code, you should try to fit them someplace. So I would encourage you to pick up the torch on the doggy daycare and kennels, which there are quite a few out there.
I think it's worth mentioning for the record that we have lost Christine Drazan. She had another commitment she needed to make tonight. And Mark came in after our roll call, but he has been present for most of the meeting, and we do continue to have a quorum. You want to add anything, Mary?
Yeah, I'll start with adding my thanks for looking at a multi-year work program. That's just the way planning projects work, and with the number of priorities and action items that we want to be looking at, limiting it to 1 year was very difficult. So thank you. This really helps to see how we can actually kind of have a plan of attack for all the different priorities. I would say that for the most part, I think the order of priorities and what's listed here is pretty good, but that I would introduce just a few things for us to talk about. Surprise, surprise, the small scale manufacturing. I would ask that, maybe if there's a way that could be looked at a little bit by staff to maybe narrow down what the question actually is, to see if there's a way to get it to fit as one of the minor amendments in the next year or so, year or two. Hopefully that could happen. I would say not part of the work plan, but if staff, when planning and maybe communications, could look at different methods for digital notification, separate from the work plan, just maybe look into it. That might be a good way to address the community's concerns about being notified of certain projects. I did want to add something that wasn't discussed tonight. L23 for the historic resource policies. I was previously on the Historic Resource Committee and HRB. And I have a lot of history as a preservation planner and writing historic preservation policies, and ours are definitely lacking in all aspects of what good preservation plans should really have. So potentially if there's a way to maybe look at that as part of maybe the natural resources phase, I think that would be very worthwhile to do. Looking at all the other priorities, I think that's probably the best fit since it is a different section of the comp plan, but it is a protection of resources similar to what we'd be looking at in the natural resources. And let's see. I will probably think of something else, but I will turn it over for everybody else to get their first comments out.
Either of you?
Work plan looks good to me. I do think, though, that the minor and time-sensitive amendments, we need to have a strong approach to that. Heard a number of citizens here talk about some small things that they're looking for, and if we delay those, I don't think we're serving the public the way we should.
I couldn't agree more with Mike on that. I think the low-hanging fruit is something that we should grab while we can and be productive in that matter. Obviously, natural resources are up my alley, being in my neighborhood. I would love to be able to work on that more. I have ideas that grow, and that's sharing these resources for habitat restoration. We currently have had a couple timber sales close to us that there hasn't been any actual sharing of that material, and it would have minimized an awful lot of carbon footprint that we're putting on a project at the confluence of the Salmon and the Sandy. And thinking about it, it just doesn't make sense that the county partners on this type of projects and does not let us access the natural resources that are available. Since they're funding parks with the timber revenues, I still think that there should be a percentage or at least an offer to the local watershed councils throughout Clackamas County to have habitat logs available. There should be orders placed. I'm not saying they should be free, but they should be available. It's not uncommon to have to go outside your county to pick up material for this, and it's extremely expensive. So I'm pushing for natural resources to be prioritized.
Murph, when you say that, do you mean move it up ahead of economics in the plan?
I'd like to see it within
Move
2
next
years,
year?
at least. We do have some changes coming with the Channel Migration Zone. Hopefully, within the next year or so, we're working on a workshop now, and if we can continue that push to have state policy formed around that gives local government some kind of foothold to regulate within the floodplain management areas and minimize the development and come up with alternatives for people that are in high hazard areas. Today was a great example of what we have to be very, very aware of. And the river just came right up, and it was close to flood stage. It was not predicted to be that high. Erosion was an issue today. I toured with Jay Wilson through my neighborhood and up above to a project that we did earlier to try and minimize some of this. The project was working fantastic. It was taking 10 to 15% of the floodwater and rerouting it, delaying it back into the river, which minimizes the amount of erosion in our neighborhood. Without seeing it, it's kind of hard to explain, but there's a big push to continue this type of wetland access, so to speak. And there'll be more on that as we continue. I'll bring it to you.
Great, thank you. So I'll share a couple of my thoughts really briefly. I like the overall concept. I think this long-term plan makes a tremendous amount of sense. I think that there's so much momentum moving on housing, and the county commission is obviously very focused on it. It makes sense to make it a priority moving forward. As many of you know, Mary and I had some conversations this past week or so with county commissioners about some of the things that we had talked about at our last meeting about how do we align this work plan with Performance Clackamas and how do we move forward. And I think there's real interest in doing that. And so I think that what is genuinely moving forward is this longer discussion between us and the BCC and economic development about looking at the county strategic plan, identifying the various land use policies that we need to make happen to move that planning forward. And I think that will ultimately help us figure out, whether economics comes before natural resources or what moves after that. I think, the reality is we've got a year or two to kind of figure that out. And, I think just because it's in writing now doesn't mean it can't be changed or manipulated a little bit. In the short term, I won't echo too much what I said earlier, but obviously the small scale commercial has come up several years in a row now. It strikes me that there's got to be a way to move some piece of that forward. And, and I don't disagree that there are other complexities there, but that shouldn't hold us up from moving forward with something smaller and more tangible. On the city of Sandy, I equate this very much to the roadie issue that we had last year, where we were struggling with how to deal with that. And at the end of the day, that community just needed some advice and counseling. And I don't know, Karen, if there's any way to make that happen. Maybe there's some way for the city of Sandy to buy some planning time, whether it's from our county or other municipalities. What I heard was they need help planning, not so much trying to find capital resources. They need to get the planning done first, and they don't have the resources to do that. And I think we should figure out, can we help them in any way? I'm sure you have thoughts on that.
Is Shorty's Corner county or clearly within the city?
I think that's actually in the city of Sandy. If I remember
No,
right.
it's outside the
Is
city.
it outside the city?
Yeah.
Yeah, I can't remember where the line is.
My impression was he was asking us to consider things that affected the city.
Well,
Be a better neighbor.
But some
they're
of the
going to be
stuff
working
on-
on including that within the urban growth boundary.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Some of the things that they talked about were at 26 and 362nd, which is definitely inside the city. So I think it really comes down to, I recognize that we've got a lot on our plate, but when our communities are struggling, I think we should go out of our way to try and help them find the resources they need to help themselves, rather than just kind of putting them off.
Well, in his defense, that's our county outletting into his city, right? Like that intersection is, yeah.
It comes down to, I think there are a lot of examples like this where longer term, I think we've got to think about how we can provide a way for people in the community, a pathwork where we be a little clear about, hey, if you would just narrow down the scope and help us figure out exactly what needs to be done, that makes it a little easier for us to ultimately fit it on the work plan and move something forward. And I don't know what that looks like, but finding a way to empower people to start putting their minds together a little more and helping us through that process. And I think that would make them feel more engaged and also, get them, find a way to funnel them into our system a little better. Does that make any sense?
I'll also add to the Sandy discussion that looking at T29, the Transportation Futures Study, I think that's an example of just why T29 is also really important. And I know staff had said this is a priority and they're working on funding for it, but I'd just like to echo that, yes, that is definitely a priority, and we've heard a lot of examples of why that is a priority.
So the last thing I will mention is I do really think this notification issue has been on our back for a long time. And I do think that the way notification does often becomes unfair to people in the rural part of the county. And and I don't pretend to know the answer, but I think we've got to at least, we keep putting off the discussion. At some point, we just got to look at it, determine if there's a better way or not, and move on. But not putting it on anywhere in here, I think, hurts us long-term. Those are my overall thoughts.
Just to mention it, Facebook and Twitter are a great place to put public information that people can select to follow. Cost next to nothing other than somebody in staff taking upon themselves to make sure it posts over. My business, $30 a month, you can schedule that stuff out as it comes over and it automatically drops. And, that would probably serve for a lot less than postcards to get beyond that half of a mile.
The reality, most of the time when the problem comes up, it's in an area where there are very large parcels, and so a very small number of people get notified. And that's the problem we need to solve ultimately, right? And that literally is going to be an extra 10 to 15 postcards at the end of the day.
So for the
to get-
cost of 10 postcards, you could probably get that rural community with a self-identified tag. I used to carpet bomb Damascus for like $300. You know what I mean? And that was 10,000 something people, So I would say there are a lot of easy ways to get outreach today for very little money, probably with an intern to start, just to test.
And so we obviously
Yeah.
can't solve that problem tonight. I just do think.
I don't think
my
it's the
personal
planning
view is
commission's-
that it should be on the agenda at some point so that we can give folks, tell folks that we are actually going to deal with this issue.
I would trust staff to figure that out and just mention, hey, you might have digital means you could use, but I don't think it's our goal to lecture them on how to communicate with the public. They're the ones doing it.
Yeah,
And it's never going to be good enough.
Yeah.
You could notify the whole county, then people would be angry. Why are you giving us all these notifications, right? There is no winning with that. But
Yeah.
I don't know if I totally agree with that.
All right. Well, I'll just take it one last time. Thank you for actually notifying people and caring and being very straightforward when they came forward. And I'd say that you could talk to your blue in your face. So,
I do have one more question for staff. For the yearly minor and time-sensitive amendments, especially considering in relation to the items we know are going to be coming up for housing, how exactly have you distributed what we know will be required from the state versus what's the minor and time-sensitive? Like, it sounds like the minor and time-sensitive ones longer in the future would include whatever's coming down from that year's legislative session. But it looks like a lot of what's coming up now is probably in the housing section.
So I think it would depend, we don't know yet we don't know what's coming from the state for housing. We know what's being considered, but we also don't know effective dates and all of that. So the most significant housing bill that I am aware of, it looks like it's gaining traction or whatever, is got like a 3-year implementation, the last draft I saw anyway. So it wouldn't really be time sensitive. I think it would fit within our time frame for the larger housing project. Last session, we had the rural accessory dwelling unit stuff, and it had a very short timeline, like July or something. It was extremely short. So I think we're going to have to evaluate based on, is it mandatory, first of all? Because if it's not mandatory, then we may want to do it, but we're not under a time crunch. And is it something that had an emergency clause and a very short implementation period for local governments? And we're going to have to try to sort those out, I think. I don't know yet, but.
So it's sort of a placeholder for if it is
Correct.
a mandated timeline
Yes.
versus, okay.
Correct, and some stuff could be housing, but I know they're making, typically every session, they make some changes that affect our exclusive farm use and forest zones, and so it's gonna be those kinds of things where we know we have to comply, and we just need to get our code updated.
One other issue that came up, hesitant to mention it, is the marijuana issue. And I will say, it does strike me that we're basically putting businesses in the county at a challenge with other cities just because we can't change our code to add an extra hour, and it seems to me that's super minor, and I think it's worth having a conversation with the county commission about. That's something that's pretty small that we could take care of that would position at least our businesses to be at a competitive even playing field with those of the cities around us. I think it's only fair.
Yeah, and I agree with you. That would not be something I would undertake as a separate project. It's not worth the
Right.
process time involved. So it would fit within a minor amendment package. I think this came up, so the board actually, when they adopted the marijuana regulations in late 2015, ratcheted back the hours. We had proposed, and I believe the Planning Commission had supported, the OLCC hours.
Right.
And the board ratcheted it back, I think probably to what we had in our medical marijuana code previously, that was not in the zoning ordinance, but in the county code, which I think is what Mario was mentioning. This suggestion was made last year, and they were not receptive to changing it at that point. And I think it was really more of a policy decision on their part than a than a staff time concern. But we can certainly raise that again if you all are or most of you in agreement that this is something they should look at, then we can make that message clear when we convey your recommendation to them.
I mean, it's just not a major policy change. It's just it's a matter of fairness to the businesses,
The competitive issue.
Setting aside the subject matter, it's really.
I mean, staff's not, we wouldn't object, and it's an easy change to make as part of another package.
So
I
I
would,
would, go
I
ahead.
would like to compliment on, all this work. It's excellent.
Karen gets most of
You all
the credit.
deserve raises.
Thank you.
Good job, very good job.
And
The
Lorraine,
format,
yes,
I think, is
Lorraine.
spectacular.
And Lorraine.
Yeah, the format is really well done.
So it sounds to me like the biggest areas that we're talking about having a difference of opinion potentially with staff's recommendation is somehow getting small-scale manufacturing sooner and then potentially looking at natural resources happening before the economics priority. It sounds like, and as we were discussing, I looked a little further, and all the ones in the economics section seem like they're low effort from staff. And I'm wondering how staff determined that economics was the priority before natural resources. I know we were talking about getting the small-scale manufacturing as a priority last year as well. And was that what the trigger was? And if we can pull that separate, then can we do natural resources first? What was kind of the give and take that staff was looking at in that
I do think
distinction?
that it was two things. One is the small-scale manufacturing and trying to recognize that has been a priority. But I do think we also were recognizing that the natural resources is going to be a very big project to take on. And so kind of balancing those really big projects with being able to do the small stuff too, right? And so I think this, at least the way that we were thinking about it, it allowed us to fit in some small before we got buried deep in some big stuff. So that was another that added to that recommendation.
So my thought on that is that, we may even find down the road that there may be an opportunity to maybe overlap things a little bit or whatnot. And I really, again, I think it makes sense to move forward with housing. I think we've been having these conversations with the county commission about thinking more holistically about how to align this stuff with a broader strategic plan. I think as we go through that process in the next, hopefully 6 months or so, that we will have a better understanding of where to go with this piece. And it's clear that the idea is a year from now to do a check-in about where we are. And, I think at that point, we evaluate, what's on our docket, what we've accomplished, and make, we've got kind of a roadmap, but it doesn't mean it can't ever change, right, or be morphed in some way. The big things for me is, so we had 3 issues: doggy daycare, the commercial small scale, and the marijuana, that seem to be pretty small things that could potentially fit into that minor amendment piece. And I think one of the things that we could do as a commission is adopt this with a strong recommendation that those things be considered as minor amendments. And I think that would serve as some direction to the staff and to the county commission about where we are on that. And then the piece on top of that isn't so minor in my mind is the notification stuff. And I would really still love to have a conversation about whether that has a place in here and how. Does that approach make sense, or?
Absolutely. We never did, it hadn't been mentioned, L15. which is low effort. And it seems to be a pretty important one.
The temporary dwellings. Does that,
Well, that'll fit under,
That falls into
under
housing.
housing, right?
Yeah,
so that we
So
got,
even though they're not listed on the attachment B summary, the intent is that everything that's been collected for the work plan recommendations would be considered in that first
and
white
it's on,
paper?
it's on there as a new project at the very bottom, right?
Those would all be evaluated, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, L15 has, there are definitely two sides to L15, so it would require some discussion about policy approach, but we would do that as part of the housing package, yes.
I would point out that Chair Bernard had very strong opinions about that historic dwellings be allowed in outright.
right.
So I would definitely gauge the rest of the county commission before making decisions on that.
Yes, I was there. I remember that.
So Jennifer, do you have any thoughts on, is the notification something staff would want to pick up? Or do you think that there's room for a conversation around that, or should we let it alone? What are your thoughts?
I mean, I think if ultimately you and/or the board just wants to change the distance, that would be a minor amendment. And what I'm going to need to do is figure out what that really means from an administrative standpoint, because that's the cost for us. It's not the
And
change.
to me, I'm not convinced that just changing the distance is
Right.
a solution. I
Right.
agree with you. It's much more complex, and it makes sense for certain projects, and that's where the time is going to take, is to
Right.
figure that out.
Right.
It might
you
not
know.
be distance, it might be something where if the project
Parcel
needs to
size,
have
it
a
could be anything,
transportation
right.
impact study, that's
Right,
sort
what's
of
the
a key
trigger?
that
Right.
would trigger more distance that more people in the vicinity of a project would want to know about it.
I mean, I do, over the years, we have definitely had circumstances where just a very small number of people get, alerted, and they just happen to find out from, maybe there's an active CPO or their neighbor knew about it, and
Right.
that's not a good notification process, right?
Yeah, I mean, we've considered that, we've gotten suggestions over the years. There's the, should we post the property, right? A lot of jurisdictions do that. The county used to do that, where you have
Makes
to put
sense
the sign
in
up.
a city when you're walking by it every day.
Right. But it becomes becomes complex given the geography we're dealing with, for us to even verify that they really did post it. And then did the sign stay up? And do we know whether the sign stayed up? And how many days was it up? And then who's going to provide the sign? The logistics of that on the scale we're talking about is difficult. And so we've never revisited it. It was repealed years and years ago. And we've, had suggestions over the years and have said, it's just not a program we want to take on. Increasing the distance, we could do some sort of I don't want to say like some sort of a discussion item
force or
with you
something,
to
yeah.
talk about kind of potential solutions, but
I mean, that would make some
Yeah, I don't
sense.
know.
What if we, at some point, this year, had a work session around
Right.
that? Had spend some time to have a conversation about what might make sense, what are the options, and
Sure.
then we can kind of at least figure out how to move, whether or
Right.
not to move forward with
Right.
it, right?
And I think we could do that. And if you wanted to maybe make that part of your recommendation, that the planning commission have a study session sometime in the next fiscal year regarding notice, and then maybe, report out to the board or
And
something.
maybe that will become a recommendation to the board.
Yeah, I
right?
think that's a good approach.
Yeah, I think that makes some sense. So I think we sort of have a plan, if anyone would like to make a motion of basically adopting the work plan
I've got
with a
notes.
recommendation that doggy daycare, small-scale commercial, and the marijuana issues, we do what we can to kind of think about how we get those into a minor amendment, and then we would have a work session around the notification process to see if there's an opportunity to move that forward.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yep.
I would move that we recommend approval of staff's work plan with a strong recommendation to the Board of County Commissioners to consider L18 for small-scale manufacturing, L20 for the missing uses with kennels and doggy daycares, and the marijuana hours of operation issues as part of one of the upcoming yearly minor and time-sensitive amendments, and then also recommend to staff to look into alternatives for notification procedures as time allows, so that we can
Second.
have a further work session.
Is there a second?
Second.
Heard it from Mark. Do you have that okay, Darcy?
I have notes I can hand you.
1 second here, hold on, there's like things happening. Go.
L19. The marijuana one was L19, if that helps, Darcy.
Yeah, I've got them right here.
You all set? Awesome. Any further discussion?
Move the question.
Okay, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Anyone opposed? Any abstentions? Motion passes unanimously. So there concludes our hearing on the long-range work program. Thank you all for your help. We need to do a few small items of business, starting with the minutes.
If I can find it, I have one edit. Page 2, halfway through the paragraph, Commissioner Pasco, things that we are getting hung up on section 5. I think that should be a thanks. 12 lines up from the bottom. That's all I found.
Any other amendments to the minutes? Is there a motion to approve?
I move we approve the minutes.
I second.
Motion moved and seconded. Any discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Anyone opposed? Any abstentions? Motion carries unanimously. So last couple things we need to do is a quick schedule review. I thought we would spend a few minutes just recapping the meeting that Mary and I had with Commissioner Savas and Commissioner Bernard. I sent a little bit of an email. I hope that was helpful. I wanted to get it out while it was still fresh in my head.
And how much coffee was drank to write that?
A while. I knew if I didn't type it up, I would forget the details. But I honestly, the long story short of it is, moving. I think there's a widespread agreement around aligning our work more generally with the county strategic plan, and that it made some logical sense in order to get there, to bring in some experts with the economic development and us and the county commission to kind of really look at that strategic plan, understand the policies that need to be changed to move the items in that plan forward, and use that to inform this work plan as we move forward. Obviously, it isn't going to affect this work plan, but I think we were thinking more longer term. So, questions, thoughts? Do you have anything to add to that?
I think it was a fairly thorough summary. I'd just say we didn't really talk specifics about goals and policies. We talked about how we want to move forward with having those conversations, so the process for that. So it looks like we're talking about having a joint work session later in the year after the legislative session, so we have a better sense of all the projects coming up. So we can have that conversation in a formal public setting later.
Yep, agreed.
Anything about schedule review?
So
next
two things,
meetings?
just a little update on recruitment for the planning commission. So the recruitment closed on March 10th. We have 2 open seats, Commissioner Fitz and Chair Pasco. Chair Pasco has reapplied, Commissioner Fitz has not. So the board, they have kind of changed the process from previous years, wherein we would interview and then we would make a recommendation, and then often they would decide to interview as well. And so we're trying to combine this into one process. And so they have appointed 2 members of the commission, Commissioner Humberston and Commissioner Savas, to participate in the initial round of interviews. And so it may be that we'll only do 1 round. It's still, the other commissioners could decide that they want to interview, but the idea would be potentially just to do 1 round of interviews. And so we're in the process now of trying to figure out scheduling for that, and whether they're going to interview all the candidates or only some of the candidates. So I don't yet know, but the bottom line is it is in the works, and the bylaws provide that our existing commissioners can continue until appointments are made. So
How many applicants?
10. I think 10. 12. Maybe it's 12. Sorry, I don't have the applications. I think you're right. I think it's 12. So a decent pool, a decent sized pool, yes.
And we did have a good conversation with Commissioner Savas about, he was asking about, how how important is diversity and a variety of other things. So I think we had a pretty good conversation. And we also talked a little bit about process, because he wasn't familiar with what had happened in the past. And I think we shared that our view was that it made a lot of sense to have a combined effort between someone from the planning commission, someone from the staff, and whoever county commissioners wanted to be engaged. So I think there's some buy-in on that
Okay,
process.
good, because I had shared that with their staff, that normally, at least the planning director and a member of typically the chair, but in this case, not
I
the
don't
chair.
think it got back to
Of
Paul.
the planning commission would, but, yeah.
And I think Paul initially was thinking that he and Ken were going to kind of lead this effort on their own, and we talked a little bit about, it helps when all the stakeholders are part of that process, and I
Okay.
think that was well taken.
Okay. So at the moment, I'm in a holding pattern until I hear from them, so.
That's great.
And then regarding the schedule, there will be no meeting on April 22nd. I think it's unlikely there will be a meeting on May 13th, but I don't want to cancel it quite yet. I will let you know. And of course, there's no meeting May 27th because it's Memorial Day. So that leads me to what is coming to you next?
Spring break.
We have kind of a quiet, it's unexpectedly quiet. There are no quasi-judicial applications currently in the door. I think Martha has one or two things that people have met with her that are sort of percolating, but we just don't know when and if something may come in. The next thing from a legislative standpoint is the short-term rental project. At this point, I think it's likely that the bulk of the short-term rental regulations will actually be part of the county code, and it'll be kind of a registration process as opposed to in the zoning ordinance. It's also likely that there will have to be probably a companion amendment of a fairly minor scope, though, to the ZDO. And regardless, we want to come and talk to you about the project anyway, even if it's going to end up being in the county code, because it's still, it certainly has relationship to the land use process. So Martha Fritzie is the project manager on that project. We are going to be engaging in a public outreach effort that the board has requested, and we obviously would have intended to do anyway, but they gave us some specific guidelines for what they were looking for. The goal is to do that in May, and then to go back to the board hopefully in June, but we'll see, schedule permitting. And we'd like to come to you kind of in that time frame where the public outreach is kind of concluded, but before we go back to the board, that's the goal. So there's a little bit of a scheduling challenge. I had been thinking June 10th. That may not work for Martha. I'm wondering if you'd be receptive to scheduling a meeting on June 3rd, which is not your normal date, if that would work for you. I will send an email out to the full commission to see, but I'm interested in finding out if that's possible. If not, we can make the 10th work, and we will. But just a thought that the 3rd might work better for our end. So, and then the other thing, and I haven't even talked to Karen about this, but the Park Avenue Design and Development Standards project that's on this year's work program, that's continuing to next year's work program, is hitting kind of a key decision point for the board in May about whether to move from phase 1 to phase 2 of that project. And you haven't really had much involvement in that up to now. And so I think if the board green lights phase 2, then I would like to just have a study session to get you up to speed on what has happened, what will be happening, what your role would potentially be down the road. And so again, I think June may be realistic for that. So we could potentially do both of those items on the same night. And again, we can do the 10th. I just wanted to see whether the 3rd was a possibility. So
It probably is for me.
those are the next two things that I see coming, barring an application being filed. So, okay. But I will get back to you for sure on the first meeting in May. I just don't want to cancel it quite yet, but definitely no meeting on the 22nd. And Darcy will send an email out for those of you who are not here tonight, but you'll all get it officially canceling that meeting. So, okay. That's all I have.
Thank you. I think we are adjourned. Thank you. Thanks.